Right. Hi, everyone. I think you're all coming through now. I can see on the participant list. So if you're here, you're probably here to find out all about getting data quality right, getting your definitions right for repairs, lettings, collection and arrears, and satisfaction metrics. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I know it's strange and unusual punishment for a Monday morning. The one thing we won't be covering will be regulatory and financial metrics. We're covering those next week. So I'm going to now try and, oh, we're getting a bit of a message there. I think Angela can't hear anything. I think, Angela, that will be a case of you just configuring your earphones. If you click on the little chevron next to your mute button, that should sort you out. But what I'd say is, James, give them a wave, James. James is here to try and sort out some of those technical issues for you. So if you could use the chat function to get in touch with James, he'll try and sort out any tech issues the best he can. I'm going to go through this. I'll show you the presentation slides in a second, but there'll be logical pauses as I deal with a theme, like, once I've finished off lettings or once I've finished off arrears. What I'll do there is I'll pause and I'll try and take any questions that I haven't covered in my slides. For those kinds of questions about the content that we'll be discussing today, if you can use the Q&A function on your toolbar, just next to the chat function, if you can set out a really kind of succinct, brief question for me on any of the metrics, I'll pick them up at those logical pauses just by going through the list of Q&As. So I hope that's okay. Just by way of introduction, Nitin's here as well, if you want to give them a wave, Nitin. Nitin's going to be taking over my role at Acuity, hosting the clubs and that kind of stuff. But James, who you've already been introduced to, James is your first port of call for anything to do with pretty much what we're going to be discussing today. Any issues you've got around definitions, any issues you've got around using the system, sticking your data into the system or getting reports out of it, and even benchmarking club admin, again, James is your man there. For those of you that don't know, I'm Steve Smedley. You don't need to know me for much longer because I'll be retreating into the background at Acuity over the next week or so. So pretty much between James and Nitin, they'll be looking after all of this stuff. This webinar is scheduled to last for an hour and a half. We will be recording it, so it'll be there if you need to go back and look at any of the detail, or you can similarly signpost your colleagues to the recorded webinar. It will appear on our website. I'll also make available these slides that I'll be using. There are a couple of hypertext links in to take you to appropriate documents, and I'll also include some associated materials. So hopefully that's that. We are scheduled, as I say, to last, I think, for 1.5 hours, and I'll be pausing, as I've said, at logical points to take questions. Use the Q&A function. Right, without any further ado, I'm going to crack on, share the screen. So hopefully you can all see those slides. So what I'm going to cover today is, before we get into the definitions, just a little reminder about what benchmarking's all about, so we're all on the same page. And then we're going to get stuck into the definitions in that kind of order. this is nerdy anorak stuff. There's no getting away from it. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but if you're going to do benchmarking, it's important that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. It is, we will necessarily have to get into some of the detail. I apologize for that. Now, it is very dry, but it's also very important if we want to get it right. So yeah, get your coffee ordered now. If you've got a kind person that lives in your household, you'll definitely need it. So a little bit about benchmarking basics. For the avoidance of doubt, when we're talking about benchmarking, we're talking about comparisons, comparing against other providers, that is. Not everything that you performance manage actually needs to be benchmarked. So the question to ask for anybody engaging in benchmarking exercise is, will those comparisons provide additional insight? And the way that you get that insight is by exploring variation in the results. So if you ever listen to the regulator for social housing talk about comparisons and benchmarking, the first thing they say is they're interested in variation. They're particularly interested in outliers. And I know most of you are smaller providers. And so you won't be getting an IDA, an in-depth assessment, but what the regulator does there is one of the first things it does when it goes into an IDA is it looks for degrees of variation in people's results. And you can use it also quite constructively to understand, to start a process of inquiry by which you can understand what's going on. So yeah, you basically look at variation to understand why the results are what they are. What's the story behind it? Is it context, or is it something to do with your performance? It also helps you identify what good organizations look like, particularly within the context of your clubs, so that you can have a discussion about good practice and see how people crack the same issues across the sector. Social housing management isn't rocket science. Everybody's collecting rents. Everybody's turning around empty properties. There are different ways of doing things. As I've said, context might be a factor. Just because you might have a bit of an iffy result on a particular indicator, it might not be down to performance at all. It might be to do with your client group or geography. In terms of getting additional insight, benchmarking also enables you to set evidence-based improvement targets. So back in the day, organizations were particularly encouraged to sort of look at top quartile performance and see if they could set their targets on that. Benchmarking data is also good for organizations with a social purpose to enable the executive to be held to account by the board, but also the board, the association in general, to be held to account by its stakeholders. Less is more as far as benchmarking is concerned. Sometimes we get overly enthusiastic clubs who want to benchmark just about everything. As I said, you should always ask yourself, what additional insight am I going to get from benchmarking here? So best focus on getting a small number of metrics right. How do you get things right? You stick to the definition. I'll show you in a few slides' time how you can get all of the definitions. They're all online. That is the way you do it. Within your organization for donkey's years, you might count things in a slightly different way because that's the way the board's always liked it, or that's how Fred or Marion in accounts has always liked things. That's great. And if that's meaningful for you, brilliant. But benchmarking is a collaborative exercise. So the only way it's ever going to work is by everybody singing from the same hymn sheet and adhering to those definitions. The alternative is anarchy, and basically something that the sector is often criticised for is, especially by its detractors, is that people don't really believe the data. So one of the ways, and as we go forward with the white paper, it's really important. I think you'll find the term data quality used increasingly, and particularly in the context of housing associations being held to account by their tenants and other stakeholders, is the only way to ensure that is data quality, and data quality starts with sticking to the definitions. Our benchmarking at Acuity, and indeed at Housemark, and Housemark looks after the bigger associations, is we're primarily interested in the forms, in the main forms of managed social housing. And what I mean by that is general needs, housing for older people, and support. There are other forms of social housing, such as shared ownership. I think intermediate is still counted, intermediate housing, and etc., etc. So there are other forms, but we're focusing on the lion's share of social housing, which is those three types. And if you want to really understand how those are divvied up, how they're defined one from the other, you only need to have a look on the profile page and click on one of the little buttons there, and it'll give you chapter and verse. There are limited exceptions to us to that basic rule of looking at general needs, HFOP, and support. And you tend to find those just in the financial metrics. And that's because those metrics span the entire business. We capture other information, for instance, other housing types, as well as stuff like turnover and staffing levels on your profile page, where you can get the definitions of the different types of social housing as well. It is really, that kind of data on your profile page is really useful when you're handpicking a bespoke peer group, because it means that you can narrow down the field. You can look for organizations that are closer in size to you within your region, or for instance, are, have a kind of a mix of HFOP, general needs, support, etc., etc. So that profile information is actually really quite useful to helping you handpick a peer group, rather than just going with the annual report that we provide for you either every 6 months or at the end of the year. So when you're submitting your data at the end of the year, don't forget to ensure that your profile page is up to date. And the way that you do that, I can show you just here. This is just a slide shot. This is what you see when you go into our system and you click on data entry. You've got a little option there, which is PI data. That's where you enter all your latest data. But just below it is the profile page. And that's where you get to update all this additional data. And this is just a little bit of a screenshot of the kind of information you've got. So as I say, if you just click on here, it'll give you a definition of these three types of social housing, but it has the other types of housing and lots of other, this is only a partial screenshot, but it gives you an idea of the kind of profile data that you need to update. I get quite upset when people think that, and this is generally people that don't fully understand social housing, where they think that the benchmarking data is the be all and end all, and you can just look at a few metrics and that's it. You've got that social landlord bang to rights. That's it. Benchmarking, this kind of data is just the start of a process of inquiry, of analysis. It doesn't enable you to just at a glance tell if an organization's rubbish or good. So benchmarking is basically a business analysis tool. It gives it helps you allocate resources based on evidence, because you've got the data, you've got cost and performance data in the round that you can look at in the round and make some decisions about perhaps where your resources should actually go. It also helps you zoom in on where you need to improve. As I've already said, it also enables you to set targets and create a little bit of space. You know, those organizations that have a little bit more of a buffer, let's say, particularly in terms of their cost metrics and in terms of the surplus metrics, that kind of stuff, have a bit more of a buffer to kind of weather the slings and arrows of an outrageous operating environment, if you like. It's also there, as I've already said, as a transparency or an accountability tool to enable others to hold you to account. It's part of being a good social organization. It also provides assurance within the organization and outside the organization that you're up to snuff. The little diagram at the bottom just kind of shows how you should be using your data as part of a process to inquire, understand what's going on, draw insight from that understanding, then make decisions about which way you're going to jump, whether that's, as I say, improvement action or allocating resources. And then you can get on to the business of actually making a difference, of implementing stuff. Benchmarking is not, as I say, the last word. Like, yeah, they've got 5 rubbish metrics, this organization's, or 5 middling and, you know, slightly dodgy metrics. This organization is clearly rubbish. No, that's not it. Your product is a social product is quite complex. Just looking at a bunch of metrics in isolation isn't enough. You need to get behind the metrics and understand the story of why it's so. Superficially, for instance, on, say, a cost metric, a supported housing provider is going to look way more expensive than general needs. That's really easily explainable because they're providing shed loads more service. So just a reduction of approach, just looking at metrics in isolation, tells you nothing. That same supported housing organization might actually get through 100% turnaround in its properties over a year because it's short-term, helping people, homelessness, or getting people back on their feet after they've had issues mentally or whatever. So having a massive void turnaround is absolutely the thing that they should be doing. But if that was just looked at in comparison to a general needs provider, those void metrics might look really sick. So as I say, context is at least as important as performance. And other contextual issues might be about geography. They might be about the actual client group. Also, you need to be looking at cost. You can't just look at performance in isolation. You need to be looking at cost and performance in the round. And quite often, because as I say, this is quite a complex social product that you offer, the metrics themselves, even a suite of metrics, need to be complemented with other information, such as qualitative information. They also need to be looked at in conjunction. So, for instance, one organization's really good arrears figures, partly why they might be looking really good is because they're letting void loss take the strain with the way that they basically they're trading void loss off against arrears. And similarly, one organization's FTAs, if that organization is just writing off really, really quickly, it will always make their FTAs look much better. There's not a right or wrong here. You know, the argument is that you just shouldn't be sitting on FTAs for donkey's years. But there's a difference in practice there that needs to be understood contextually before you can draw too many performance conclusions. And lastly, this benchmarking is not a calibrated tool for league tabling. and for exposing people and beating people up. It's an intelligent business tool to help you ask questions about why things are going on, where you might need to do a bit more poking about, and what you might need to improve. Finally, definitions can't legislate for every single eventuality. Sometimes they need interpreting based on what that metric's actually trying to do. That's where the clubs come in. We can have a debate about it at clubs if there's a particularly thorny little issue. And what we always do, because we work in conjunction with Housemarque, is we'll check with their policy, their data guys, just to see how they're handling a particular definition. That's pretty much it. I just want to make a simple point there. As we get stuck into the detail of this, when you look at the calculation of any metric where you've got something is being divided by something else, when we're talking about the numerator goes on top and the denominator goes on the bottom. It's as simple as that. And from that calculation, you'll get the actual result. I'm just going to, sorry, yes. So the other thing is, although we're going to be going through the definitions today, and if ever you've got a really thorny definition issue, it's just not a problem. You just get on the blower to us and ask us for some guidance. But the definitions are all there for you. They're online. So this is a little screenshot from where you enter your data. And if you just click on the little blue question mark against any of the metrics, it will give you chapter and verse, and it will give you the content from which I've drawn these slides. So it's all there for you. If that doesn't give you the answer that you need, just get on the blower to us or email us and we will put you right. You don't need to struggle in silence. And as I say, it's absolutely essential that you try and get these definitions right so that everybody's got confidence in the data. Right, I'm just going to pause here just before we get stuck into the metrics. I'm seeing that there's no Q&As come through. So that's great, because what we can just charge through the metrics now. So, oh, hang on, we've got something come through. Yes, Imtiaz, nice to see you getting stuck into this. Yeah, if with an Acuity subscription, you can have as many people on the system as you like. So I've got, I haven't told James this, but I've got his details right at the end of the presentations so that you can steer all your queries to him. But yeah, just get in touch with James and he'll sort you out for usernames, passwords, that kind of thing. Just whilst we're on that subject, my personal preference is that somebody within your organization takes charge of overseeing data entry. Now, that doesn't mean to say they're entering all the data for the organization, but if you can do that, that's a good thing, because that person becomes the resident expert. But I also appreciate that you might have a number of, say, heads of service or key officers that are responsible for entering the data. So you might have 2 or 3 people entering data. That's fine as well. Just make sure they all know about these definitions and the rigor by which we want them to approach this endeavor. But as I say, if you can get one person entering the data for all of this, so they become a bit of an expert, I think that will help the definitions, help us get the data right. I think where you have got a number of people entering data, if you've still got a first amongst equals data-wise at your organization, and it might be the CEO, it might be the one person, somebody just below CEO or whatever, who's going to take it on themselves to ensure that whoever's putting in the data has actually done it. Just give them a bit of a chase up. That works really well too. I think we've got some more questions. Hi, Helen. Yeah, Helen's just saying. Yeah, Helen's just, I think, just saying how they're slicing and dicing their access to it. That's good. Right. I shall crack on, if that's okay. So let me just share the screen again. So I'm going to knock off the lettings and voids metrics first. And by that, I mean 4 main metrics that pretty much most of you collect. I've put them as their series reference. So here, some of you that just collect general needs will collect it as GNPI 30. Those of you that are, I think, collecting metrics for older people will be collecting it as HMHO 30, and then supported people, the other one. It's basically the same metric, it's just sliced and diced for the client group, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. And so that goes on with all of these. There are even some metrics where that's aggregated for everybody, as opposed to split down. So they're the metrics that I'm going to be covering. Percentage of rent lost through dwellings being vacant, average relet time for your bog, standard routine voids, and then it's kind of little brother, the average relet time of all major work voids. So those two, the major works voids and the average relet time just above it, they traditionally, back in the day, they went hand in hand to be able to cope with all the voids that you might have. Some of you don't collect the major, well, most of you, I think, don't collect the major works voids anymore. I've included it here because you need to understand what a major work is to be able to get the average relet time right. And then I've just got relets as a percentage of stock. What I would say about all of these is that they generally conform to core definitions of these various things. So for those of you that do the core inputting, it basically follows the same kind of definitions, categorization stuff. So let's get cracking. So percentage of rent lost through dwellings being vacant. The rationale of this metric is it's all about the optimum use of social assets and your revenue maximization. It also lets the organization know something about its return on investment forgone from unlet assets. Major works are included in this. That's the thing to remember. So your bog standard average void, your routine void turnaround metric, as you know, excludes major works. That's not what this metric does. This metric wants to know about all of your voids, basically. So the calculation is basically rent and service charges lost due to dwellings being vacant, divided by your gross rent and service charge receivable. And all of that is multiplied by 100 to give you the percentage. So a little word about the denominator here. The definition, gross rent and service charge receivable, that's your total potential rent and service charge collectible for the period. So that might be on a quarterly basis, half-yearly basis, or for most of you, the vast majority of you just collect these metrics on an annual basis. So that's for the whole period if all the dwellings have been occupied. And so, as I've said, dwellings may be vacant for any reason, and that includes dwellings that using core type language, dwellings that are unavailable to let. So that really does include major works and those that are held for decant. The only unavailable to let that you can exclude are those that will never be let as social housing again. And we're talking about largely those that are awaiting from demolition. So you basically ignore those completely. So you can see the point about this metric. This metric isn't interested in void turnaround at all. It's really interested in the loss of money from assets because they're vacant for any reason. If you're collecting this quarterly, in terms of your numerator, it's quite simple. It's just the year-to-date rent and service charge loss. And the denominator is simply a prorated annual rent service charge debit. I think I've already really laboured the point about you excluding your major works. I mean, they're the main ones. Including your major works, what am I saying? And your held for decant. Right, so that's that one. I'll crack on. So this is your average relet time indicator. Now this is about understanding the efficiency of a key business process of any social landlord. And this really does zoom in on something. This is just really concerned with bog standard routine lets. It's what you do 90% of the time, even 95% of the time, I don't know. And the calculation is basically the total number of days that a standard relet properties were vacant in the period, divided by the number of standard relet lettings in the period. There's no timesing by 100 because this is just an average rather than expressed as a percentage. So what do we mean by number of days vacant? That's the number of days between the tenancy end date and the tenancy start date. There are 7 days in a week. That's what we mean by calendar days. But the property that the day the property goes vacant does not count. You can get 0 days. You can't get negative. And believe me, folks, people do try it occasionally. What do we mean by standard or routine? We largely mean no major works, no new lets, no successions or mutual exchanges, and no voids held for decant. These are excluded completely from the top and bottom of that calculation. And here's the thing. Once you've sorted out a major works void and it's there all pristine and sparkly, you can't bring it into this calculation because once a major works void, always a major works void. And it will be until it's let. It doesn't exist in this universe whatsoever. It's in the next slide. And so you can see that the entire definition of this metric here for your average routine relets is completely contingent upon the definition of major works. And that's coming up in the next slide. For this metric, you only include the void in this calculation once it's let, and you include the whole time. So it doesn't matter that it first became void in a previous reporting period, even a previous year, just does not matter. When you finally let it, yes, you're really relieved, but it's going to make your figures look really stinky. There's a sting in the tail in letting that troublesome void. As I say, any questions on any of these voids and lettings one, if you just register your question on the Q&A function now, I'll pick them up as soon as I've done with these voids and lettings ones. So over to the little brother metric of the previous one. This is major works void, and it's fallen out of fashion now. It was a fashion 10, 15 years ago, and it was particularly the fashion when you had a whole bunch of organizations that were kind of gaming on this because they wanted their normal relet metric, the one that we just discussed, because they wanted it to look really good. What they'd do is they'd wallop any void that looked vaguely troublesome, they'd stick it in here so they could get away and make their other figures look good. Obviously, that's really uncool, and it's not something that you guys would do. But at the time, that's why this metric, they ended up developing this metric so that you couldn't just squirrel away a multitude of sins here. And I have actually seen organizations 10, 15 years ago that might have 50% of their voids in this metric, simply because they didn't want the other metric to look bad. So the rationale for this is similar to the previous one. And as I've said, it's mainly used now as a way of being transparent about the ratio between major works voids and your routine voids. So the calculation is the total number of days major works properties are vacant in the period divided by the number of major works lettings in the period. The treatment of days, calendar days, etc., is exactly as the previous metric. And as I've already said, major works never magically become routine. They always stay separate. So differentiating between a major works void and a standard void just comes down to the definition of major works. And this is the main thing to remember here. It's the rule of thumb is, could that work reasonably be carried out with a tenant in situ? Or would you, if there was a tenant in there, would you be looking to decant them? So we're talking about really, really extensive works that would be really miserable and unreasonable for them to actually grin and bear sort of staying in their home. So the point is, are the works so extensive that if it was tenanted, I'll be looking to move them out to get this done? That is the test for this. And way back, I think this was the, I don't know, the Department of Local Government of the time, the CLG or whatever it was called, came up with some pointers about the kind of works that might be so extensive that you might get a tenant out of there. And we're talking about real full-on structural stuff, site works around the area, that's around the externals, that would make it like really dodgy to actually even enter the property. We're also talking about service installations, but interestingly, work that significantly improves the dwelling. So I know a number of you during the void period will try and crack on with, if you like, some of your planned replacement and stuff. So this might have a bearing there. So the question to ask there is, if during the void period you're doing works of an improvement nature that are so extensive that you'd probably decant a person if they'd been living there, well, you can call it a major works void. Hope that's clear. The final one in this series is relets as a percentage of stock. So the rationale here is, it could be about performance, but quite often it's about context, this metric. But it certainly does provide some context for your other relet / voids loss indicators, because this is enabling you to understand the churn of your dwellings. And as I've said, if you're a supported provider that's rehabilitating people, getting them on their feet, or you're dealing with homelessness, you're dealing with domestic violence, obviously you're going to have tons of churn, and that's a good thing. If you're a typical general needs provider, having real churn isn't necessarily a good thing. It might indicate that your neighborhoods are kind of going into a bit of a decline. And whilst you haven't got, we're talking socially, economically, or those neighborhoods might be becoming somewhat unsustainable because they might have problems, as it were. This might be a trigger for other kinds of intervention in terms of, looking at regenerative type measures in conjunction with other landlords and the local authority about turning around certain neighbourhoods. Anyway, this is what that metric's there for. The calculation is number of properties relet during the period divided by the number of properties managed multiplied by 100 to give you a percentage. So this is, as far as the definition is concerned, it's looking at the relets as a proportion of the units managed. And you'll remember from earlier slides, I said most of our metrics here are really concerned with managed properties because it's judging how well a landlord, and it might be that you're managing stuff for others. So it's looking at how well the organization is actually managing social housing functions. So with this metric, you actually exclude stock that might be owned by you if it's not managed by you. If you cast your mind back to the void loss indicator, we included all dwellings that were vacant for any reason except where not being used for social housing again. This metric's the same. So this is doing something different from the standard relet turnaround time and the major works turnaround time. This is just like void loss, doing something different. It's looking at your actual turnover of stock for any reason whatsoever. So I'm just going to stop sharing there. And have a little pause and have a little look at some of the questions. So Helen, yes, slides plus other materials, plus a recording of this will be available on the website when we've finished. That's that one done. Cool, Helen, you give you a real hard time, I can see already. Yes, and I've answered that one as well. That's the recording one. Back to Imtiaz. Imtiaz, would this include dwellings bought to refurbish before the first let? I think that's this is where the, remember I said definitions don't deal with every conceivable eventuality. And this is one of them where you might have acquired properties. What I would say about that is if you think about what these definitions are trying to do, particularly the major works one and the major works one and the routine one, this would definitely not feature in the routine one. Arguably, it could feature in the major works void. So if you've just bought a property and then you're completely revamping it, you might want to do it. But again, the definition's silent on it. I think it's touch or go whether you might include it, because it's unusual in that you've just acquired it and it's not been in your possession. I think you could take a view on it and jump either way on that particular one. I'm sorry, that's slightly fudgy. Pamela in Birmingham, what happens if the service is being decommissioned and you are not sure what the next service will be and there are voids as a result? Pamela, can you have a second bite on the cherry with that one, because I'm not sure I completely get the question. Zoe, there is no, you've said, what's the definition of a major and a minor void? I'm not saying there's a major and a minor void. I'm saying there's either a routine void, which is an empty property, comes up and you just have to do the basic repairs and relet it again. That's a routine void. And then there's a major works void where you have to undertake the kind of works that I've said on the slide that are of quite an extensive nature and that you probably have had to have decanted the tenant. Howard, in calculating rent loss due to properties being empty, why don't you include ones waiting demolition or major refurbishment? They are still losing income. The books. Well, as I've said, in that case, you are counting major refurbishment. In terms of void loss, you're just looking at all money foregone because they're empty. The only exception is those destined for demolition. And I don't know why you've got dispensation for the demolition, but at some point back in the noughties, they thought that that was a justifiable reason to exclude it. So for the avoidance of doubt, you should be including those that are awaiting refurbishment. Steve, Mann, we've got 2 major works voids this year that have been empty for 12 months. Does this make this metric 100%? The major works void is actually just looking at the average number of days that something was void. So it's only when they're let you're going to get a certain number of days. The answer won't be expressed as a percentage. Let me know, Steve, if that doesn't deal with it. But let's say you've got 2 voids. They're up to 365 days now. They're both up to 365 days. I would say if you let them both straight away now, your average major works voids time would be 365 days. Let me know if that's not answering your question. So if a client moved from one property to another, are they ignored? No, they're not. If this is just a transfer within your own stock, those voids, that's still a normal void. If that transfer was a mutual exchange, it wouldn't be counted because it's just like a succession. It's, as I remember from 25 years ago, my housing law, that's them just simply stepping into the other person's shoes. So the tenancy hasn't actually been ended. So that's not a bog standard void, but a transfer within your properties is. Oh, that's Helen again. You're very welcome, Helen. Amy, just to clarify, our kitchen and bathroom upgrades can be carried out in occupied properties, though it's not always practical, I can imagine. If done when void, should these be considered major works? The issue is, Amy, it's as I say, the rule of thumb is, can I do this work with the tenant in situ? I know it's an empty property, but if there was a tenant there, could I do it with them in situ? And you've kind of answered the question in that you're saying you know, although you don't like doing it, if you do that kind of work with a tenant in situ, you can't count it as a major works void. So yes, you'd have to count them. It's only if it's so extensive that you have to move them out. God, I didn't think I was going to get so many questions. Pamela, I'm going to come back to yours. For a major works, this is Paul Martin. For a major works property, do I understand correctly that this remains a major work void until occupied and not ready to occupy? Absolutely right. It's it stays a major works void until it's let. Mary, managed properties, void works carried out by a landlord. We do not have control. Do we have to include these in? Right. I think Mary's saying because she hasn't got full control over the process, thanks to the landlord. Do we still have to include those? Yes, you do, because it's all about managing something, and I guess the rub of this one would encourage you as an organisation to sort out a better procedure with the landlord on nailing these. Paul Martin says, similarly, we have a new flat being created. Does that become live from the date occupied or the date it becomes habitable? In these void metrics, we're not talking about new lets. We're talking about relets. So new lets shouldn't be included in these. And actually, I think I may have answered my previous question. I think Imtiaz is one where you've got an acquired property, and it's because that's a first let for you. That's actually a new let. So yeah, I go back on what I said. That shouldn't be excluded. That should be excluded because these are all about relets, not new lets. Yes, and Angie's made a point that they do bathrooms and kitchens with tenants in situ, but wouldn't do both at the same time. So they would probably treat something as major works if doing both at once. I would agree, because that is just too much to bear. So that's a good example of how that might be a major works. Jan is saying, how will the last year affect on turnaround time for repairs, relets, etc., be acknowledged in benchmarking figures? I am sure everyone has experienced extended timescales to complete things. This is a good point, Jan. I think we're going to get, we can already see in void turnaround figures, not so much in the arrears figures, but void turnaround figures have been adversely affected this year thanks to COVID holding things up. But again, if you look across the piece, across the sector, that means that all of your turnaround times have edged up a bit. So there's a story to be told there when say you're reporting to your board individually as an organisation, you can set it in the context of voids and lettings metrics have particularly been adversely affected over the past year. And you can point to show how the sector's medians, across many landlords, has slipped accordingly to kind of contextualize the impact that COVID's had on your metrics. But you're right, it hasn't had an impact. And it's mainly here, although some landlords have probably taken a bit of a 1% hit or so on arrears as well. Yes, Cassandra says, average relet type standard let-ins, does that include properties managed by another organisation? Yes, definitely. I take you back, back with some of the slides, you'll see that I've made bold the word managed, but also in the preamble, I said this is all about managed property, so absolutely. And I'm really sorry, Pam, but I don't know if I'm being a bit thick. How do we decommission these? How do we record voids on decommission? Right, so I think what you're saying is that you're decommissioning services in relation to properties before the contract ends. If you're saying that those properties they're not going to stay within your management and they're going to go elsewhere, I'm thinking they should be excluded. But I think the only way we're going to sort this one out is because this is a very peculiar thing that the definition's silent on, and that we probably need to square outside of this meeting, Pam. So if I can come back to you outside this meeting, we'll actually nail this one. But yeah, I think it's it might be a bit like the demolitions or whatever, that you kind of knock it on the head if it's not within your remit anymore. Whoa, I didn't think we'd get so many. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to crack on. Let me just share. But thank you for all of those. Shows that you're listening. So let's crack on with rent collection and arrears. I'm only going to be looking at 3 here. So that's rent collected. I'm going to look at your current tenant arrears as a percentage of the annual rent debit. And a number of you collect your rent arrears net of unpaid housing benefit as well. So I'm not going to say much about that, but since a number of you collect it, and it has a bearing on the one just above it, that's why I've included it. So first up, so here's your rent collection metric. The rationale, a bit like voids turnaround, is a key process indicator. So it says something about the efficiency of a key business process, but it's also about income maximization for the business. And so, if you like, it in a way sits alongside void loss as a way of ensuring that you're maximizing the amount of money available to you. So the calculation, quite simply, is the actual rent and service charge income received year to date. The reason it says year to date is some of you collect it on a quarterly basis, divided by the actual rent and service charges due year to date. This is solely interested, this metric, in the effectiveness of your current collection process. The arrears metrics that are coming up, they're more backward looking. They reflect a more historical position. Like some of you, for one reason or another, like COVID, or because of staffing arrangements 3 years ago, where you took your eye off the ball with rent collection, might have a historical problem that you're now over time trying to resolve. So that's what the arrears metrics do. They're more backward looking than this. This is very much looking at how you're doing now, getting the money in. It is possible to score over 100% if you're making headway into your historic arrears. Yeah. So the other thing to bear in mind here is garages do not feature in this metric anywhere. Exclude them from both the numerator and denominator. What do we mean by actual rent and service charge income received? We mean it's actual. You're not fiddling about with it. There are no adjustments for late housing benefit payments, and you're not adjusting for prepayments or post payments. You're just taking everything as it is. So you are including your prepayments, you are including post payments. And you're not kind of saying, oh, if only we were taking this figure tomorrow, we'd have all this housing benefit in, so we're just going to adjust. You are not adjusting for this. You're taking as it is. And the point is the arrears net of housing benefit figure. We haven't got a collection figure net of housing benefit. We've got the arrears net of housing benefit. That deals with late housing benefit in 2 slides' time. So where possible with this metric, other non-rent or service charge items collected by the landlord on behalf of others should be excluded if possible. So some of you might still collect water rates or whatever for whoever. Yeah, that's a service charge, but it's not your service charge. This is about when we're talking about collecting service charges, that's your service charges. Service charges like water rates, somebody else's. If you can exclude them, you want them out. If you can also separate out any old court costs and repairs, recharges, overpaid housing benefit, they need to come out as well. If you can't split them out, you need to include them in both numerator and denominator. With the denominator, rent and discharge is due, you exclude void loss, basically. So any void loss in there isn't actual rent and service charges due, because the property is empty, and in any case, we know from the previous suite of metrics, you're picking up void loss anyway. So, so exclude your void loss. You are also, and most of you know this, you're excluding tenant arrears brought forward at the beginning of the year. So previous tenant arrears up to year start, they're in the metrics that are coming next. They're in your arrears metrics. This is just a kind of, whenever the period starts, start of the year or whatever, this is like wiping the slate clean. You're looking at what your actual rent and service charges due are for that year, regardless of whether that person's previously got rent arrears. You're just looking at what's due and what you've actually got, and you're just counting that. So the only arrears that should ever show in this metric are the ones that have accrued during the year. Oh, here comes my coffee. I hope you guys put your order in. So the next metric up is the arrears metric, the principal arrears metric. So that's arrears as a percentage of the annual rent debit. And again, this is just another metric that just looks to see that you're making inroads into historical arrears, and it sits along your side the previous metric to better understand income maximization. I would say this metric is particularly useful over time, because let's just say you got into difficulties some years ago and took your eye off the ball and you ended up, your arrears went up. What you want to be seeing, more than comparing to others, I would say, is you want to be seeing your own figure for this decline, improve over time. So the calculation is actual current tenant rent and service charge arrears at the period end. Again, period end is in there for quarterly people, but for most of you, this is just at year end, divided by the annual rent and service debit for the current financial year. And again, this excludes void loss. So from this metric, you exclude void loss. You also, as before, exclude things like court costs, if you can, and sundry debts like recharges and garages. You also exclude arrears from previous tenancies and FTAs. And as you know, we have a separate metric that picks up FTA arrears. So again, you know, this is only interested in the current, your current tenants and their arrears. Simple as that. Again, you're not adjusting for late housing benefit in any way. Even if you've just missed by a day, you're not fiddling about for that. And as I say, the next metric picks that up. There's a little bit of a, I hesitated to put this section in, but because it's only there for those of you that collect on a quarterly basis. But basically, the point is this: if I were you, I'd be asking me, if I'm collecting this quarterly, how the devil do I provide you an annual rent debit for the current financial year that excludes void loss? Because If I'm 3 months into the year, I don't know what voids I'm going to get in the remaining 9 months. I might know the first 3 months, I've got them, that's fine. So how can I give you an accurate figure for that, Steve? You'd be saying. The answer is whatever you have at the quarter end, whether it's the first quarter or the second quarter, for your rent debit, excluding void loss, you project it forward. I'm not going to get into it too much, but I've set out the calculation here for how you do that. This is quite an arcane thing. I don't want to waste any more time on this calculation because it won't apply to a lot of you, but trust me, that calculation will work for you. Finally, this is the rent arrears net of unpaid housing benefit. It's basically just like the last metric, but what this, quite simply, it'll allow you to do that little adjustment to deal with the housing benefit cycle. Simple as that. So if you were the person that kind of, all of a sudden your housing benefit is coming in, and this is very, very specifically just due to late housing benefit, i.e. this is benefit that you don't think is coming in, is benefit that you know is coming in. And the problem is where you are in the cycle means that you've just missed it. This is where you can adjust for it. That's it. So I'm just going to pause here and I'll just take, because time's cracking on, I might have to be a bit selective around this, but here's the point. If nothing has been satisfactorily answered for you during this session, just grab us outside the meeting and we'll sort it out for you. So I'll just have a quick look at this question. Oh, Helen, I knew you'd ask me a really tricky question. Helen's question is, on the point about quarters, how do I ensure that my data is comparable when I have a January-December financial data collection period? The simple answer, Helen, is, especially with these performance metrics rather than the cost metrics that we're doing next week, is it shouldn't really matter, providing you're working to the same quarter. It should be possible for you to do it. I appreciate that your year end is like 3 months before everybody else's. So even if you were kind of filling it out retrospectively, so you ended up at the same point that everybody else ended up, I think the difference is going to be so marginal that it doesn't matter. And the point is, the most important figure out of all of these is the last one, where the entire year is accounted for, and that's what goes into the benchmarking report. So the short and the tall of it is, and it's another rule that should apply to any benchmarking, is you don't let, if something's relatively minor and immaterial, don't let it worry you, just worry about the material things. And I don't think that being 3 months out on something like this is actually that material. So I hope that's okay. Right, conscious of the time, guys, so I'm going to steamroller on through the repairs ones. The satisfaction one is relatively simple to deal with, so that shouldn't take us too long. Right, so here we go. Here are the repairs metrics that we'll be dealing with now. So I better get cracking. So first one is the average number of repairs per unit. So all of the previous metrics that we've been talking about, depending on which club you're in or your stock, We often differentiate between general needs, HFOP, and supported. Here we don't. Repairs are repairs. They're just social housing repairs across those three types. Again, to a great extent, this metric might be as much to do with context as it is about performance. It is a useful can opener to discuss in club meetings. You know, a high number might mean a whole bunch of things. It might point to poor diagnostics or a poor application of the repairs policy. Like, we often have debates at the club meetings that perhaps some members are more generous than others. And do they really need to be, or are they killing their tenants with kindness to some extent? Could a high number be because some of them are reworkings? They're having to go back and put something right that wasn't done right first time. And of course, we've got another metric for that. But it could be about tenant profile. Like, it could be that you have particularly needy or demanding tenants by virtue of their profile. It could be to do with stock profile, that we're talking, you know, some landlords have problematic stock profile and might have historical issues as well as kind of unusual built form type issues. So this really is one of those metrics where you can't just look at it and just go, oh, that organization's rubbish, this one's really good. You have to, as I go back to a previous slide, you know, you have to dig deeper to understand why something is so. The calculation is the total number of responsive repair orders issued during the benchmark period divided by the total number of repairs for which the landlord is responsible. So here again, to get this definition right, you need to know what we're talking about when we talk about reactive or responsive, and those two terms are interchangeable. So we're really talking about all minor or ad hoc, unplanned. This is the opposite of planned. Planned is your improvement work, you know, typically, traditionally, they would be programs of improvement work. Cyclical work is planned. This isn't cyclical, this isn't planned. So minor, ad hoc, it doesn't matter what the priority is, we're capturing all of those minor unplanned repairs. They might be reported by tenants, but they might be picked up by you and your staff as you go walkabout. So it's also repairs to common parts. It is a repair is something that is a defect that is the landlord's responsibility to make good. And if you want to get forensic about it, it's in a specific bit of legislation. Really, what we're trying to do with this job is, this metric is count jobs rather than SOR lines. And this is where this definition can get, or this metric can get a little bit difficult to get consistency. Some organizations batch up a whole bunch of SOR tasks into one job. Others might kind of count them a bit more separately. But really, where possible, if a job's like, say, to renew a ball valve and cistern or whatever, and blah, 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 it's a specific job, you don't want to be fragmenting it down into too many SOR lines. You aim for the job rather than loads of SOR lines. It's not an exact science. And where this unravels a little bit for some is where those organizations go around and do an MOT style visit, and they'll batch up loads of different things into one kind of mega job. But again, this is where the club meetings are useful to kind of draw out this kind of context to explain why somebody might be a bit of an outlier on this, for instance. And also, where you might get differential practice as well is some organizations might include or exclude handyman type repairs. What you definitely need to exclude, and for what it's worth, my personal take on the handyman type repairs is that it's a repairs, and you know, it's an ad hoc thing that you've gone and done. If you can count them, I think you should. In terms of exclusions, as I say, any repair undertaken as part of a predetermined maintenance program, so that's planned maintenance, but it could be cyclical as well, they are excluded. And that includes anything that crops up as a result of making good that type of thing. So if somebody's gone in to do a gas inspection and they've done some remedial work, obviously that remedial work is excluded, because even though you didn't know what it was, you've gone round to do something that was predetermined maintenance program and you fixed it. That is actually planned / cyclical, because it's part of, you knew you were doing it beforehand, and that would include any making good. So if your gas person's like been fiddling around with some pipe, I don't know, pipe work or something, and then you need to make good with a plasterer or something, that plasterer job technically doesn't need to be counted as one of these, because it's still, its origin was with a planned one. And of course, you don't include voids. Void repairs are somewhere else, they're not here. Percentage of repairs completed at first visit. This is the metric that was formerly known as the percentage of repairs completed right first time. People had problems with that. This metric is clunky. It's been fiddled with, not least of which is its title being fiddled with. Over time, it's been fiddled with a lot, to the point where you're just wondering just how good this metric is anymore. Back in the day, it was all about trying to expose councils that were fairly rubbish at doing repairs. And since then, all kinds of tweaks have come in to address what landlords saw as being a bit unfair. Notwithstanding all those tweaks, it still fails to pick up something that's quite important to smaller housing associations, which is most of you don't have operatives that go around with a van and a load of impressed stock on board, by which they just nip into their van and get, you know, a certain ball valve system, rad valve, etc., etc. What they do is they have a quick look at the thing, then they nip out to B&Q and come back. And the tenant's delighted with that, because, you know, they're in, you know, it's only going to take 20 minutes, half an hour. Technically speaking, that's not getting the job done right first time, unfortunately. So this really doesn't work in a lot of your favor, but all I can say is, if that's happening with the way this metric is written at the moment, you can't include it as right first time, even though the tenant's dead happy with it. Hopefully little problems like this might get addressed when the regulator takes forward its consumer metrics. The calculation for this is the number of response repairs completed by the operative without a need to return a second time, divided by all responsive repairs completed, regardless of their priority. One of the fiddles that has come up with this metric over the years is this now allows for multiple trade visits where those visits are essential and that they're known in advance. So where a job requires multiple trades, the work complete, as long as each of those trades, those essential trades that were pre-identified, as long as they've done their bit of the job in one hit, it still counts as a job done in one hit. So you might have, say, a plumber go in, do a load of, if it's known in advance that you're going to need a plumber, and then you're going to need a plasterer, and then you're going to need a decorator, and each of those trades does their bit of that in one hit, that's counted as a job in one hit. you know, I'm not saying this is big or clever, you be the judge, but them's the rules, that's what the definition says. You exclude totally any pre-inspections, because the point is that's not a response repair being completed by an operative. So a pre-inspection to diagnose is perfectly fine, and you don't include it in this. The metric is just about the remedial action bit of it, not the inspection bit of it. If you can't get access, you don't count it. Average end-to-end time for all reactive repairs. Now this supersedes the metrics that are coming next after this, which are the time-banded metrics for your performance against percentage repairs completed on target. And most of you have reports where these 3 time bands are featured. It's widely regarded that this is a superior metric to them, because the old school metrics aren't great benchmarking metrics at all, because individual organizations can set different repairs targets. So, I can look really good, say, on an urgent repair compared to another organization if I've set a really long urgent repair time, and I'm comparing it to an organization that set a really short urgent repair time. That's bonkers. But for some reason, a lot of you still really like these metrics, and I think probably your boards still like these metrics. I don't think they're great. This metric is more of a leveler because it's just looking at the average, start to finish time of all repairs. The theory being that tenants just basically want a timely service, so a shorter average might suggest a more efficient process. But of course, an efficient process is nothing to do with tenant satisfaction. The calculation is the sum of the total number of calendar days taken to complete responsive repairs in the period divided by the total number of responsive repairs completed in the period. And as far as the definition is concerned, the average number of calendar days between responsive repairs being requested and its satisfactory completion includes the day of request and the day of completion. That date of satisfactory completion is decided by the landlord, not by the repairs, whoever's doing your repairs or whatever. So that's the average end-to-end time for all reactive repairs. Now, these are the ones that I've just dissed, the old time-banded repairs. I'm not going to say much about them. I've already given them a bit of a kick in. There's your calculation there. I don't think these are particularly rational, as I've already explained, with possibly the exception of the emergency ones, because if you look at things from a tenant perspective, getting an emergency repair done is one of the things that you want to have assurance on, that it will be done within 24 hours. And where I think this metric works better than all the others in this suite is most people have a target time of 24 hours. And providing the vast majority have a target time of 24 hours, I think this is worthy of comparison, the emergency repairs. One of the other things that I think is wrong with this is, although, for instance, you've got emergency repairs here, urgent and routine, and the actual definitions for these set out a list of the kind of jobs that might fall within each of these brackets. At the end of the day, the definition still gives you wiggle room to horse trade jobs between those different bands. So not only have you got the capacity here for individual landlords to set different target times, but you can also horse trade between what jobs are in which pigeonhole. So all I'd say is, I'm not convinced this is a good metric for any of us to be using anymore, apart from the emergency ones. I think you might be better off with the previous metric was the average end-to-end time. So I'll just leave it with you guys to think within your own organizations about just how useful this should be, or how useful it is. As far as satisfaction is concerned, satisfaction with the most recent repair, I'm going to deal with that under the next section. And I think we might, I'm going to give you a bit of a 10-minute warning. I think we might overshoot by 10 minutes. I'm quite happy to stay on if you guys are, because it would be good just to finish this off. I had no idea how long this might take. Never done this kind of thing before. I was hoping I may have left the building before Acuity decided to do something like this, and so I could have copped out. But yeah, it's taken a bit longer than I thought, but hopefully it's useful. So we will stay on for 10 minutes longer. But as I say, those of you that need to leave, by all means leave and get back in touch with us with your specific issues. So I'm just going to stop sharing and just have a quick look at some questions. So Francis is saying, hi Steve, just wanted to clarify on December financial year, when completing the return data for the year, should I provide figures for my financial year, January to December, or should I take my annual figures for 2020, deducting the first quarter, Jan-March, and add my Jan-March 2021 figures? Right, Francis, there's different ways of dealing with this, and it's not an issue for a lot of organizations. It's only if you've got a funny year end. What I would say is if you've got a funny year end and you're only collecting your Acuity data on an annual basis, it really doesn't matter. You could treat your year end, you could just take all your figures at whatever your year end is. And if you're a January to December your year end, you're only going to be 3 months out of sync from everybody else. So, and again, all of this benchmarking stuff, you only worry about things is if the results are going to make a material difference. This won't make a material difference. If you're, say, reporting your performance over a year on a 12-month basis, and you know everybody else is also reporting it on a 12-month basis, but you're only 3 months out, that's just not going to be material at all. And so I just really wouldn't worry about it. And again, if it's easier for you to, if you're collecting on a quarterly basis, just go through the quarters, your quarters, slightly out of sync with everyone else. That should be fine too, for exactly the same reason, in that it's really not material. I think the only time I think it might kind of raise its head is if we have one of those situations where at a specific time in the year, there's been a lot of something happen, like a particularly wet year where there's been lots of flooding or rain damage or something like that, but it shouldn't make a massive material difference. So really, I encourage you not to worry about it. Steve Warren, hi Steve, is saying, I thought we got rid of right first time because it's so useless and not reflective of tenants' wishes anymore. Well, thanks, Steve. 5 is in the post year. We certainly have got rid of it for you lot in the Southwest. You're absolutely right. But what we've got is we've got tons of people from all over the country sitting in on this. So hopefully you've persuaded a load of them to knock it on the head just like you guys have. But thanks for that, Steve. Helen Green saying, we struggle with average end-to-end time measure as it could be seen to encourage organizations to categorize jobs as urgent rather than routine. Right, I'm just going to have a slurp of coffee. right, the average end-to-end time measure for repairs should be capturing everything, all of your routine jobs. So it's not, there should be no hiding place, because it's capturing all responsive repairs is what I'm saying. So as I say, I think having something that captures average end-to-end time for all routine repairs tells you something about the efficiency and speed of a process, if we believe that's part of what tenants want. And if that's then complemented so you can isolate emergency turnaround, I think the two of those in conjunction are actually probably quite useful. Bernadette Kennedy, hi Steve, average end-to-end days, does that include non-working days if the repair goes over a weekend? It does. That's why the term calendar days is in. So a calendar day is definitely 7 days a week. I know back in the day, and that this would have been about 15, 16 years ago, we used to have things like working days in the definitions. That's all gone by the by now, because we're all immensely customer focused. And Paul Martin, thanks, Steve, for this presentation. I have to log off now. You see, Paul's probably already gone, but I think what he's saying, Steve, sort out your time management. But apparently it's quite useful as well. So that's good. So yeah, I do apologize, everyone, for us overshooting. Impossible to quantity survey these things. Right, you're in the final straight. I'm going to release you all very, very shortly. So let's just quickly crack on through satisfaction. I haven't got much to say about satisfaction. Oh no, I forgot about the gas ones. Oh dear. All right. Before we get to satisfaction, we've got gas. So this, the percentage of dwellings with a valid gas safety certificate. So you all know what the rationale is for this. And it includes not going to prison. So calculation is the number of dwellings with current valid gas safety certificate at the end of the period divided by the number of dwellings the landlord has a gas safety obligation under the gas safety regs for, multiplied out by 100. What the definition says is you must have a copy of the the certificate. In terms of the denominator, remember that's the bit underneath, the number of rented dwellings in ownership that have a connected gas supply. So this, you only should be counting those dwellings in ownership that have connected gas supply. So it's not all of your dwellings, just those with a gas supply. Where the gas supply is disconnected, you can exclude those metrics from the denominator. But you must have, some kind of audit trail saying that that has indeed been disconnected. Where you've got tenanted properties with disconnected gas pipe work, you can only exclude them if you've got a record of an annual check to verify that the gas supply is still disconnected, i.e. that the tenant hasn't taken it upon themselves to get resupplied, because then you've got an obligation again and you have to get it sorted. So moving swiftly on, a number of you, with this metric, this is the most boring one to see in your annual reports, because everybody's scoring 100%. Yeah, that's great because you're not going to prison. And, there'll be the occasional one that's been really stuffed up with a troublesome tenant that hasn't allowed access, and you've got kind of 99% or 99.95% or something like that. So because that was, most of you find this a bit easy to do, we came up with this metric, which is far more onerous. So it's similar to the last, but more challenging. With the previous metric, what you might have is lots of safety checks that fall out of the 12-month deadline, but you go absolutely balmy, get all your staff out, pulling out all the stops in the last few weeks of the year, through March, to get access so that you got 100% certificates on the 31st of March. The metric here, G15C1, catchy title, seeks to deal with that. It's more onerous. It identifies where a safety check has exceeded the 12 months at any time in the year. So if at any point in the previous 12 months, you've had something go outside of the 12 months, it gets counted. And what does it do? Well, like a lot of metrics, it's not just about measuring something, it's about actually forcing you to do something. And in this case, the metric actually makes you put in place a systematic process to ensure that you get in there ahead of the 12-month expiry. And I think a lot of organizations have got such a process in place, and they're kind of trying to get in 10 months into it, 11 months. And a number of you that during the initial lockdown last March, April, when you couldn't do these things, as soon as we came out of that lockdown, a lot of you that were really on your mettle brought forward a lot of your gas inspections really early doors, because you had the foresight to know that this might happen again. And so what you actually had was a lot of organizations that were actually way ahead of their curve last summer, and nailing things like 9-10 months into their time period. So that's all I want to say about that. So yes, this is the final slide. You'll be pleased to know, satisfaction. We can't get into a big debate about surveying practice. We can always, we've had some good, at least one good webinar with Denise from Acuity, telling you how to nail your surveys and giving you the latest information on surveying practice. I would encourage you to look at that on the website. But the basic calculation of any satisfaction metrics is basically the number of respondents who are very or fairly satisfied with a specific issue, divided by the total number of respondents to that question, multiplied out by 100 to give you a percentage. The primary satisfaction metrics from STAR, the main satisfaction metrics that you've got, that you collect, are actually STAR metrics. So the point is, and they're the old ones that we know and love for ages, and notwithstanding the fact that STAR's been reviewed just recently. But the point about those metrics is you should be adhering to the STAR methodology to populate your data with that. I.e., if you want to be using things like satisfaction with the landlord services, satisfaction that the landlord listens and acts, satisfaction with the home, satisfaction with neighbor, all of those metrics, if you're sticking data in on your data sheets for this, for those metrics, you should be adhering to the STAR methodology. And I've given you a hypertext link to the latest methodology here, so you can get chapter and verse on that. But the kind of things that it includes is that the questions are phrased in a specific way, and that there are 5 response categories with a neutral middle, and that you've got appropriate sample sizes for both perception type metrics and transactional type metrics. Now, for a small organization, that's actually tough to do. And it often, or certainly can, mean that you just have to that you have to survey everybody to actually get the sample size. We do have an online sample size calculator for you, but what we're going to attach to the materials with this webinar, along with this presentation, is a spreadsheet that's actually not quite as clunky as the online one. And that will help you, depending on your stock size, define the right sample sizes for both perception and transactional type questions. And for the avoidance of doubt, a perception type satisfaction question is just a general question that asks a tenant, how was it for you, darling? That kind of thing. Are you satisfied that your landlord gives you a good service? Are you satisfied with your home? Whereas a transactional question very much follows a specific contact point with a tenant. So, for instance, satisfaction with your last repair is a transactional question. If you're asking a tenant if they're satisfied with the way that their complaint was handled, that is a transactional question. And I would say in most cases, certainly with, say, satisfaction with complaints handling or satisfaction with ASB handling, if you do those questions, you are surveying everybody sensor style, because you actually you're not just doing it so you can get a metric out of it, you're doing it to understand the quality of those services. So if you have sort of come up with if you have got your data for the various satisfaction metrics as a result of a methodologically sound STAR survey, whether you've done the STAR survey yourself or got a third party in, those results are good to go. You can just stick them in the data fields. Those remaining satisfaction metrics that aren't STAR metrics tend to be very transactional. So it is the satisfaction with ASB and complaints or whatever. These are typically a small number of cases, especially for smaller housing associations, so that it is like the sample size is irrelevant. You'll be getting feedback from everyone. So whatever feedback you get in, however many it is, and it's generally not going to be, it's certainly not going to be like super representative, if you like, of the tenant body. It's certainly representative of everybody that's gone through the ASB or complaints process. You'll want 100% of the results reflected in your data there. Watch this space for the white paper. I think the RSH, the regulator, will be consulting the sector informally on this in the next few months about how it takes forward the satisfaction side of things. And remember, I was talking about data quality. That, again, is first and foremost. It'll be interesting to see if they go so far as to expect your data to be validated independently. It's not on the cards yet. It's happened once in the past. It'll be interesting to see if they go that way. Just an unashamed plug for ourselves there. You guys all exist to deliver great social housing services, not to be survey companies. We do that, and we can get the survey right. We can even help you get a survey right from start to finish, undertake the survey, strategically think about it in the first place, help you analyze the results. There's a decision within your own organizations to be made, whether you want to tie yourself up in knots doing this or just get an organization like us in. Others are available to do it. Plus, it gives you and your stakeholders the assurance that it's been done by a third party. So I simply flag that. So I'm now 14 minutes over. So I'll just very quickly try to shoot through any remaining questions. Imtiaz, you're very welcome. He's just saying that it's useful. Maureen, over in the West Country. Hi, Steve. The suite of KPIs is very good and should be done. It would be helpful to narrow down 2 or 3 per category, e.g. repairs, that help the board over time monitor impact for value for money customer. Do you have any ideas on how best to identify these as smalls? Maureen, I wrote sector guidance for this 12 years ago when people cared about consumer metrics. That's another link. We'll stick another link on the website about the process by which you could come up with, I think, a customer-focused dashboard of metrics that means something to tenants. It does mean that you have to have conversations with tenants about what matters to them, but you can come up with a consumer dashboard. I think it's really worth doing, notwithstanding the fact that the regulator is going to be doing a similar exercise for the sector as a whole, because at the end of the day, yes, there might be an overall suite of consumer metrics. The point is you have a relationship with your own constituency of tenants anyway, and it's really, I am sure, as part of this white paper rollout stuff, you will be expected to understand what their priorities are and what they think a good service looks like. And from that, you can come up with a killer suite of metrics that wouldn't surprise me if it overlaps with the regulatory ones. But all I say is I'd crack on and do that anyway, and you'll be hot off the blocks for whatever regulator comes up with. Steve Warren saying, of course, some housing associations may have worse gas servicing figures this year because tenants have denied access due to COVID. Either they have had the virus or were self-isolating. I presume we cannot exclude these. No, Steve, you can't. There's no dispensation. What I would say about this is it's a bit like some of the voids figures. There'll be a sense to which the sector as a whole has gone through this, and therefore the sector medians, like for instance, if you're comparing yourself against the sector medians, that sector median will have slipped as well. So there's a story to be told to your stakeholders there, whether it's the board or your tenants, that you will see that our performance slipped here. There's a story behind that. That's because people were either self-isolating, or it was because, for a time, our suppliers were actually self-isolating, and we struggled with that. So the point is everyone's in the same boat, and there's a story to be told around what happened with those metrics. And I think it's a legitimate story. Jan is saying, thanks for the webinar, you're very welcome. Helen, thanks, you're very welcome, Helen. And Steve Mann, really good session. I don't know about that. He's only had one coffee. I've only had 1/3, and it's gone vaguely. My voice is going croaky now. I'm not ever going to do this again, folks. Maureen is saying, yes, Steve, that's what I'm looking for, customer dashboard for our board. Please add it as a slide to your set. Yes, I definitely will. I'll send you the link to the thing that I wrote. I think it was the Corpy that paid for it or something. Angie is saying, thanks so much, very informative. Angie, I just make it up. Pam saying, thanks, you're very welcome. And Saeed, yes, also very welcome. And Bernadette, right, no more questions. You can mark me down, folks, on overshooting by 15 minutes. I do hope that was useful. We'll stick all the materials on the website. Any issues, we get in touch with James in the first instance. Anything that we've not dealt with for you properly, I need to come back to Pam. Get in touch with James initially, but otherwise all the materials will be on the website. You don't need to scream into a paper bag by yourself on solving these problems. We can help. Without further ado, I'll let you all get yourself a coffee, and hopefully see some of you next week. And I'll see if I can find a way of getting out of that one. Okay, bye everyone. I'll see you all later.